The barn breathed in silence. Soft afternoon light slipped through the cracks in the weathered wooden slats, casting long golden stripes across the hay-covered floor. In the far corner, seated as if awaiting an invisible judgment, was Tazmira Coltbreach. Her faded red dress hung loosely on her small frame, the fabric worn at the elbows and cuffs. A linen scarf covered her dusted blonde hair, and her pale gray eyes stared ahead, still and unreadable, as though they'd already accepted that the world had stopped caring. On her left, standing firm and alert, was Whispawn, the black goat with wise, piercing eyes and horns curved like ancient roots. She didn't move much, but her presence was heavy, grounding. On Tazmira's right, curled in a soft nest of straw, lay Tarnick, the pale cream-colored filly with a soft muzzle and strong legs still too new to stand confidently. From time to time, she would gently nudge Tazmira's shoulder with her nose, an unspoken comfort, as if asking her not to disappear inside herself. This barn wasn't shelter. It was a cage. Ever since her mother had taken ill, Tazmira had slipped further into the margins of her father's tired eyes. The drought had killed the fields, and the bills stacked up like firewood. And her father, who once tucked her in at night and told her stories about stars, now only muttered things like, "One less mouth to feed." That morning, without even a word, he had locked her inside the barn. Left her there, like a crate of old tools, forgotten and ready for auction. But Tazmira didn't cry. She had already learned that crying didn't change silence. And now she had only two souls left in her world who hadn't turned their backs on her: Whispawn, who had never left her side through winters and windstorms, and Tarnick, whose birth she had helped guide on a frostbitten morning while the rest of the house slept uncaring. Outside, voices drifted over the dusty wind. Deep, unfamiliar voices. Men discussing numbers, weight, condition. One voice stood out, firm, confident, and impatient. Gracelok Thornveil, the auctioneer. He was there to inspect the animals ahead of tomorrow's sale. The sound of boots on dirt drew closer. Then the rattle of the barn's chain. Tazmira's stomach turned, but she didn't move. She didn't give them the satisfaction of fear. Between the goat, the filly, and the forgotten girl, something was stirring, unspoken but undeniable. A tension, like the brief stillness before a storm that changes everything. Whispawn's ears perked. Tarnick lifted her head. And Tazmira, for the first time in hours, closed her hand into a fist. What was about to happen inside that barn wasn't written on any ledger. And no man, no matter how many auctions he'd run, was prepared for what would come next. The heavy latch on the barn door jangled again, this time more forcefully. Outside, the men's voices grew louder, closer. Tazmira could make out parts of sentences now. How many head? We'll take the whole lot if the price is right. That black goat's got good bones. Each word sliced through her chest like a dull blade. She glanced at Whispawn, whose nostrils flared, and then at Tarnick, who shifted her legs uneasily in the hay. The filly let out a soft, questioning whinny. Gracelok Thornveil wasn't a cruel man, not in the way Tazmira's father had become. But he was indifferent, and sometimes that hurt worse. He ran the livestock auctions in this part of the county for over 20 years, a pillar of honest business, as they called it. But honest didn't mean kind. Honest meant moving animals like numbers on a ledger, bundling up life into categories and estimates. And if Thornveil saw Tazmira through the slats of the door, he'd likely assume she was just another stray not worth mentioning. Footsteps crunched outside. The barn door creaked open halfway, and warm sunlight poured in. Tazmira squinted as the silhouettes of 3 men blocked the entrance. "There's the goat," one said, pointing. Whispawn didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her body between Tazmira and the light, unmoving as stone. "She's a fine one," said another. "Strong legs. Good horns. Might fetch decent." Gracelok nodded without emotion, jotting something into a notepad. Then his eyes flicked to Tarnick. The filly's cream coat seemed to glow in the shaft of sunlight. "She's still young," one of the men murmured, stepping forward. "Needs training. But look at that stance." Tarnick's ears pinned back. Her muscles tensed beneath her skin, and she let out a sharper, warning whinny this time. "Skittish," someone muttered. Gracelok narrowed his eyes. "Something's not right," he said under his breath. "That goat's too still. They didn't see her at first." Tazmira sat motionless behind the animals, barely breathing. Her hand was on Whispawn's flank, and she could feel the goat's heartbeat, a steady, slow rhythm, like the ticking of an unseen clock. Tarnick shuffled again, uneasy. The men were still talking, but none dared to step closer. Not yet. There was something strange in the air. A sense of warning, of boundary, of protection. And then Gracelok leaned sideways, just enough for the light to shift, and he saw her. A girl. Dirt-smudged, silent, fierce-eyed, crouched between a goat and a filly like a secret someone had tried to bury. He blinked once, unsure what he was seeing. Then, in the kind of quiet that comes before thunder, Tazmira met his gaze, and did not look away. Gracelok Thornveil wasn't a man who rattled easily. He had handled angry bulls, dishonest ranchers, and enough family disputes to last 3 lifetimes. But the sight of Tazmira Coltbreach crouched silently behind a goat and a filly, it gave him pause. Not because she was a threat, but because it made no sense. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one had mentioned a child. And certainly not one that looked like she hadn't eaten properly in days. He cleared his throat, stepping back half a pace. "There's a girl in there," he said flatly. The 2 men behind him peered into the dim barn. One frowned. Thought Coltbreach said he had no family left here. The other muttered, "Maybe she's a neighbor's kid, or a runaway." But Gracelok knew better. The look in the girl's eyes wasn't the look of someone who had stumbled in by accident. It was the look of someone who had been left behind, deliberately. Inside, Tazmira kept her hand on Whispawn's side. The goat hadn't moved. Neither had Tarnick. They were like anchors, keeping her grounded, keeping her from being swept away by the wave of strangers and decisions that loomed just outside the threshold. She remembered her father's words, "Stay quiet, and you'll be fine." But fine had never felt like this. Fine felt more like invisible, replaceable, for sale. Gracelok stepped forward again, slower this time. "What's your name, girl?" he asked, voice low, not unkind. Tazmira didn't answer. Whispawn shifted just slightly, as if ready to place herself even more fully between the man and the child. "You don't have to be afraid," he added. "We're just here to take a look at the livestock." Still no answer. He sighed, closing his ledger and tucking the pencil behind his ear. "We'll finish up out back," he told the others. "Give her space." But the truth was, he wasn't ready to write this off. Something about the way the girl sat, how those animals surrounded her like sentinels, gnawed at the edges of his instincts. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. And Gracelok had learned, over many long years, to trust when something felt off. As the men turned to leave, Tazmira finally blinked. The worst hadn't happened, yet. But something had shifted. She had been seen. And not just by the man with the ledger, but by the world outside that barn door. She didn't know what that meant yet. But Whispawn lowered her head and exhaled, and Tarnick brushed her soft nose against Tazmira's arm. The moment was fragile, but it was the first crack in the silence. The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the trees when the barn fell silent again. The sound of boots and murmured conversations faded down the dirt path. Tazmira sat where she was, unmoving, eyes still fixed on the crack of sunlight beneath the door. Her mind ran in circles, trying to make sense of what just happened. Gracelok Thornveil had seen her, and hadn't dragged her out. That alone was a twist she hadn't expected. She didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. Whispawn finally moved, letting out a soft grunt as she lowered herself beside Tazmira, pressing her warm side against the girl's leg. The old goat's breathing was calm, deliberate, like she was trying to tell Tazmira they were still safe, for now. Tarnick let out a long breath through her nostrils and settled her head gently on the girl's lap. Tazmira looked down at them and blinked hard. She hadn't cried in weeks. She wasn't sure she even remembered how. But now, something in her chest cracked, just enough to let a quiet sob escape. "I won't let them take you," she whispered, voice barely audible. "They can have everything else, but not you." She wrapped her arms around Tarnick's neck and leaned her head against Whispawn's shoulder. The thought of the auction tomorrow gnawed at her like a slow fire. They would come. They would open the doors. And they would try to take them. Take the only living beings that had stayed by her when everyone else walked away. Out on the porch of the main house, Tazmira's father sat in a worn-out rocking chair, puffing on a cigarette and sipping from a mason jar. He had no idea she'd been spotted. And even if he had, it likely wouldn't change anything. He'd made up his mind. Everything with a heartbeat had a price. Everything could be sold, as long as it bought him time or whiskey. He hadn't spoken her name since the week her mother went to the hospital. Maybe forgetting her made it easier. But not everyone forgot. Back in the barn, something stirred in Whispawn's posture. Her ears perked up again, and she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something far beyond human range. Tazmira noticed it too, an uneasiness. Tarnick lifted her head from Tazmira's lap and gave a short, sharp snort. A moment later, a twig snapped outside the barn. Not the slow, methodical sound of Thornveil or his men. No, this was different. Closer. Lighter. Like someone who wasn't supposed to be there, watching. The barn remained cloaked in stillness, but now there was a pulse beneath it, an awareness. Tazmira stayed close to the animals, her breath shallow. She could feel Whispawn's body tense again, her ears twisting toward the back wall. Tarnick's tail flicked nervously, and she let out a quiet, warning whinny. Tazmira held her breath. That snap, it hadn't been imagined. Someone was outside. Someone was close. A second twig cracked, followed by the faintest shuffle of feet through dry grass. Tazmira turned slowly toward the back of the barn, where a smaller side door stood nailed shut. At least, it had been. Her eyes narrowed. The nails looked disturbed. One was hanging loose. Someone had been there. She rose to her feet, stepping slowly toward it, one hand still brushing Tarnick's side. Whispawn didn't follow. Instead, the old goat stood her ground, like she was daring whatever was outside to come through. Tazmira reached the door and pressed her ear to the wood. For a moment, nothing. Just her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, a whisper. A voice. Soft, unsure. "Taz?" Her breath caught. That voice. It didn't belong to any of the men from earlier. It was younger. Familiar. A memory buried under weeks of silence and loneliness. "Tazmira, it's me. It's Nimro Talbrecht." Her eyes widened. Nimro had been her cousin once removed, or maybe just a neighbor boy. No one in the family ever explained it clearly. He used to bring her honey sticks from the feed store, back when her mother was still up and laughing in the kitchen. But he'd stopped coming around after the hospital visits began, after her father started drinking heavier. Still, she hadn't forgotten his face. And now, somehow, he was here, whispering through the wood. "Are you okay? I saw them bring buyers. I think they're gonna sell the filly and the goat," he said, voice trembling. "They don't know you're in there, right? I can get you out. I can break the latch tonight." But Tazmira didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted back to Whispawn and Tarnick. The bond between them wasn't just comfort, it was survival. She couldn't leave them. Not for her own sake. Not even if Nimro was offering a way out. Because if she walked away and they were taken, she'd never forgive herself. The silence between them hung heavy, until at last she whispered back, "Not without them." Outside, Nimro was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Okay. Then we wait for night. I'll come back. And we'll all go together." The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the farm cloaked in a heavy stillness. Shadows stretched long across the fields, and the sky was painted in deep hues of blue and ash. Inside the barn, Tazmira sat alert, waiting. Every sound made her nerves tighten: crickets chirping, the creak of wood, the wind brushing against the rafters. Tarnick stood close, sensing the tension in the air, while Whispawn remained planted near the door, as if guarding against fate itself. Tazmira had never felt time move so slowly. Her fingers played nervously with the hem of her dress as she strained to hear movement outside. Nimro had promised. He would come back. But promises didn't always hold in her world. She had learned that the hard way. Still, something in his voice earlier, shaky but determined, made her believe, if only just a little. And now all she could do was wait and hope. Then it happened. A soft scrape. A breath. The faintest tug at the back latch. Tazmira moved carefully, whispering to Tarnick to stay quiet. The filly shifted but obeyed. Whispawn turned, eyes locked on the door as the metal latch gave a soft click. A sliver of moonlight spilled through the newly opened gap. Nimro's face appeared, pale, anxious, and lit only by the faint silver glow. He looked older than she remembered, like life had made him grow up faster than it should have. "I brought a cart," he whispered. "It's hidden near the tree line. But we have to move quick." Tazmira nodded. "Tarnick won't walk far. She's still young." "I know," Nimro said, already stepping inside. "I brought a harness. We'll lift her if we have to. She's not heavy." He crouched near Whispawn, who eyed him with suspicion. "You too, big girl," he murmured with a nervous smile. "No way I'm leaving you behind." Working quickly, they looped a rope halter gently around Tarnick's head. She resisted at first, but with Tazmira's calming voice, she eased into it. Whispawn, surprisingly, followed with no resistance, her gaze never leaving Nimro, as if silently weighing his soul and deeming him worthy, for now. With a racing heart, Tazmira led the way, pushing the door wider as they slipped out into the night air, thick with the scent of soil and stars. They had taken only a few steps toward the trees when a shout erupted from the porch. A man's voice, angry, slurred, unmistakable. Her father was awake. The shout cracked through the night like a whip. Tazmira froze, heart slamming against her ribs. Nimro turned instinctively toward the house, eyes wide. On the porch, illuminated by the glow of a dying lantern, stood her father, barefoot, furious, and holding a half-empty bottle. "What the hell are you doing?" he slurred, stepping forward unsteadily. "Get back here. Right now." Tazmira didn't wait for Nimro to answer. "Go!" she shouted, gripping Tarnick's halter tightly. The filly hesitated, confused by the sudden noise, but Whispawn charged ahead as if she understood everything. Nimro grabbed the rope and pulled, guiding them toward the trees. Tazmira followed, breath shallow, feet thudding against the dry dirt. Behind them, her father shouted again, louder, angrier. Then came the crash of a chair toppling, followed by stumbling footsteps. The cart was barely visible, hidden behind a row of old oak trees. Nimro had backed it into the brush, covering it with feed bags and a tarp. He scrambled to pull it free as Tazmira pushed Tarnick forward. "Come on," she begged. "Please." Tarnick snorted, unsure, but with Whispawn by her side, she took the step. And then another. Her muscles trembled, but she moved. Tazmira's eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from hope forcing its way back into her chest. Her father's voice rang out again. "Closer now. You think you can steal from me? That's my stock." His boots hit the path hard. "You little brat. I'll sell that filly for parts if I have to." The words cut through the dark like blades, but Tazmira didn't stop. She climbed into the cart and reached back to help Tarnick up, just as Nimro grabbed the reins. "He's almost here," Nimro warned, panting. "Hold tight." Whispawn jumped in last, without hesitation, and took her place beside Tazmira, her body braced against the girl's side. The goat's chest rose and fell quickly, but her eyes burned with defiance. Nimro cracked the reins, and the old mule hitched to the cart jolted forward. The wheels creaked, then rolled faster, bouncing along the uneven trail. Behind them, her father screamed one last time, but his voice was swallowed by the trees. Tazmira didn't look back. Her hands gripped the wooden edge of the cart, her knuckles white. Whispawn leaned against her. Tarnick's head rested in her lap, trembling. The wind stung her cheeks, and her eyes blurred with tears, but this time they weren't from fear. They were from something she hadn't felt in weeks. Freedom. But for how long? The wheels of the cart bounced over the rugged path, sending jolts through Tazmira's body as she clung to the side. Trees blurred past them, tall and silent in the moonlight. The wind burned her cheeks, but she didn't care. Whispawn stayed pressed against her, a warm barrier in the dark, while Tarnick's head remained in her lap, ears twitching at every sound. The filly was young and tired, but she hadn't given up, not yet. Nimro didn't speak. His eyes were locked ahead, scanning the path, his jaw clenched. His hands gripped the reins tighter with every bump, every shadow. He knew they weren't safe yet. Her father might be drunk, but he wasn't stupid. If he wanted to, he could saddle a horse and follow them. And if he did, he wouldn't come alone next time. He'd bring the sheriff, or worse, Thornveil and his buyers. In his mind, they were still his property. "We'll cut through Muck Ridge Creek," Nimro finally said over his shoulder. "It's shallow this time of year. The trail's rough, but if we can make it past the ridge, we'll be out of his land." Tazmira didn't answer. Her throat was too tight to speak. But she nodded, and that was enough. She had no idea where Muck Ridge Creek was. But anywhere that wasn't that farm, that barn, that porch with that man yelling threats into the night, anywhere was better. As they crossed a field of tall grass, the mule slowed, sensing the ground shift beneath its hooves. Nimro jumped down to guide it by hand. "Stay low," he said. "Keep quiet." The trees thinned ahead, and Tazmira could hear the soft trickle of water. But just as the creek came into view, a new sound broke the calm: dogs. Barking. Far off, but not far enough. Tazmira's heart pounded in her ears. Her father had set the hounds loose. She knew those dogs, mean, desperate things trained to chase livestock and strangers alike. Tarnick stirred, lifting her head. Whispawn's nostrils flared. The goat shifted to the front of the cart, her stance low, ears forward, teeth bared. Nimro turned to Tazmira, eyes full of panic. "We don't have time to cross slow," he said. "We run through it. Now." She grabbed the halter and held on tight. The mule plunged into the creek, water splashing cold against the cart's wheels. Tazmira held her breath, her arms around Tarnick, as the cart rocked wildly. Behind them, the barking grew louder. Closer. The scent of damp earth and fear filled her nose. This time, she didn't ask herself if she'd make it. She asked if she'd survive what came after. The cart lurched violently as it reached the middle of the creek, water splashing high onto the wooden planks. Tazmira held Tarnick tightly, shielding her from the worst of it. Nimro tugged at the reins, urging the mule forward, but the animal faltered, hooves slipping on the slick stones beneath. Behind them, the barking of dogs tore through the trees. Closer now, frantic and hungry. The air was thick with panic, the moonlight shimmering off the water like shattered glass. "Don't stop!" Nimro shouted, pulling hard. The mule groaned but obeyed, muscles straining as it climbed the far bank. The cart tilted, one wheel lifting for a heart-stopping moment before slamming back into place. Tazmira gasped but didn't scream. Whispawn stood at the front of the cart, legs spread, eyes locked on the shadows behind them. She wasn't afraid. Not for herself, at least. Only for the girl. Then, from the trees, they appeared. 3 hounds, snarling, eyes glowing with fury. One lunged forward, crashing into the shallow water. Tazmira screamed as the cart jostled again. Tarnick neighed in fear, trying to stand. "Hold her!" Nimro yelled. "We're almost through." But the dogs were fast. Too fast. In that moment, Whispawn leapt from the cart. The goat landed in the creek with a splash, hooves slamming into the water as she turned to face the dogs. Tazmira screamed again, this time in disbelief. "No, Whispawn!" But the goat didn't hesitate. She charged the first hound, ramming it square in the chest. The dog yelped and fell back, stunned. The other 2 circled, barking wildly, unsure whether to attack the goat or continue after the cart. Nimro didn't stop. He knew what this was, sacrifice. The mule pulled harder now, sensing open ground ahead. The cart crested the far bank, jolting violently as it hit dry earth. Tazmira turned, eyes wide with horror as Whispawn fought below. She was smaller, slower, but relentless. A barrier. A shield. The cart rolled into a thicket, finally slowing as the trail narrowed. Nimro jumped down and grabbed the harness, panting. "We can't stop," he said, voice shaking. She bought us time. We can't waste it." But Tazmira couldn't move. Her body trembled as she clutched Tarnick, her heart split between survival and heartbreak. In the distance, the barking faded. Or maybe it was drowned out by the roaring silence in her ears. She didn't know if Whispawn had survived. All she knew was that, for the first time, she had been protected, not because she was useful or valuable, but because she was loved. And now, she had to live like it meant something. By the time the first golden light of morning touched the tops of the pine trees, the cart had stopped moving. Nimro sat slumped near the mule, exhausted, mud-caked, and barely able to keep his eyes open. Tazmira remained seated, cradling Tarnick's head in her lap beneath a blanket he had found in the back of the cart. The filly slept, worn out but safe. Her chest rose and fell with a gentle rhythm, alive. They had made it through the woods and crossed onto the edge of an old, abandoned orchard, long forgotten and overgrown, but still beautiful in a quiet, lonely kind of way. Nimro had remembered it from childhood, land that once belonged to a family named Muckridge, but no one had lived there in decades. It wasn't much, but it was far enough. Far enough from the auction, from the porch, from the shouting. And for now, that was all they needed. But the absence of Whispawn sat like a stone in Tazmira's chest. She hadn't spoken since the creek. Not a word. Her body moved when needed, her hands worked when asked, but her heart was still back in that icy water, watching the only soul who had ever stood between her and danger walk straight into it. She had pictured it 100 times already. The charge, the splash, the moment Whispawn turned toward the dogs without fear. That image would never leave her. Nimro didn't push her. He gave her space, tending quietly to the mule and checking Tarnick's legs for signs of strain. He didn't say what they both were thinking, that the goat was likely gone. But grief didn't need confirmation. It planted itself anyway. And in Tazmira's young heart, something was changing. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was remembering, feeling, becoming. By mid-morning, they found a dry, half-collapsed barn on the far side of the orchard. With effort, they cleared it enough for Tarnick to rest in the shade, and for Tazmira to curl up on a bed of old hay. Nimro started a fire in the clearing nearby, and for a moment everything was still, peaceful, almost sacred. She sat watching the flames dance, her mind drifting, when suddenly leaves rustled at the edge of the trees, and out of the brush, limping, battered, and covered in cuts, but standing, came Whispawn. Tazmira bolted upright, tears already falling. The goat stared at her for a long second, then trotted forward as if nothing had happened. No grand reunion, no drama. Just two souls that understood they had survived. Together. And now, maybe for the first time, they could truly begin.